All right. Oh, it's louder than I expected it to be. I'll just talk more quietly. How's everybody? Good to see all of you. We're going to continue our study of the book of Ecclesiastes, getting into chapter 3. If I had given myself more time ahead of time, I would have had the birds playing, to everything, turn, 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 because that's this chapter today. But I didn't give myself enough time for that. So let's begin with a prayer. Dear Lord, you have created all things. You have even created time. On the first day already, you had created evening and morning. And each of those days, it repeated, evening and morning the first day, evening, the morning, and morning the second day, and so on. You put the sun, moon, and stars in the sky to mark the seasons in their times. Lord, you have made a time and season for everything, as Solomon declares in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Help us to recognize this, Lord, that there are seasons for some good things and seasons of some bad things as well. But in all things, you are eternal, and what you do endures forever. Give us confidence in you and hope in your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. All right, so to start off our study today, there's an introduction question. Number 1, when was the last time you felt like you had enough time for everything? Belinda. Since you stopped working. Now you suddenly have maybe too much time. But it still goes by pretty fast. Anyone else? Now you have all this time, you don't feel like you have to get it done. Yeah. What did you say, Paula? Yeah, always use more time, right? Anyone else? Dennis? Isn't that one of the great tragedies of life, right? You work your whole life for that day until you can finally have enough saved so you can retire, and then health-wise you're perhaps not able to do everything you wish that you could with your time now that you finally have. Yeah, so today in Ecclesiastes, Solomon is going to talk about time, and time for everything. So we'll start with the first 8 verses, which is basically the song by the birds. Of course, Solomon wrote it first. But it says, chapter 3, there is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens, a time to be born, and a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to uproot, a time to kill, and a time to heal, a time to tear down, and a time to build, a time to weep, and a time to laugh, a time to mourn, and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones, and a time to gather them, a time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search, and a time to give up, a time to keep, and a time to throw away, a time to tear, and a time to mend, a time to be silent, and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. We should add that to our hymnal, right? The new hymnal. They just came out, by the way, with a list of the hymns that are going to be in the new hymnal. If you go to christianworship.com, you can find them there. A lot of these same ones from Christian worship, the hymnal that we've been using. I think they've added quite a few hymns, taken out a couple ones that we've never sung, I don't think, ever in my lifetime. I've known them because I've, flipped through the hymnal before, but never sung them in church. So I did notice that one of my favorites, it was on the chopping block. And if you want to know if every vote counts, well, I voted for that hymn, and they kept it. So it was just for me that they kept one of my favorite, that we'll actually sing not this Sunday, but the first Sunday of Advent. There's a voice in the wilderness crying. It's one of my favorites. All right, so we looked at verses 1 through 8. You see a lot of opposites here. It's not all good things. It's not all bad things either. Number 2, discuss what insights Solomon's use of opposites gives us. when looking back on the times in our lives? Yeah. When you're young, you're not used to seeing death, and so every death is kind of a surprise, isn't it? Yeah, so verse 7 too, it's time to be silent and a time to speak. We're going to talk a little bit more about that one a little later on too, but yeah, so it teaches us that there are different times in our lives. It's not just all one thing or all another thing, and not necessarily all good or all bad. Anyone else? Pastor? Yeah. Yeah. We don't get to decide when we're born, and we're not supposed to decide when we die, right? That's all in God's hands. He starts it off with one all-encompassing one, right? From the first moment of our lives to the last moment of our lives. And then all the other ones that he lists, well, those will come in between, but he starts with the big ones. Yeah. Yeah, you notice it doesn't say a time for us to kill or a time for us to heal. It just says a time to heal, or a time to heal, and all the other ones are the same. Yeah. Right. 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 Yeah, so we see with Israel, right, that their time didn't always match up with what God's desire was, right? Sometimes he wanted them to eliminate the Canaanites, and when they were done, he set their bounds and right. Yeah, yeah. So you could take those as kind of being representative of death and marriage. Jim, I thought I saw your hand a little bit a while ago. Maybe not. Just scratching. I do that too. And other people do, and it always throws me off. But yeah, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them. It, sure. Yeah. Maybe make a path or something like that. Yeah, I'm not totally sure, and of course, it may be lost. It's a little poetic for us, a little idiomatic from Solomon's point of view. He would have known what he meant by that, but we don't always get to know exactly. Dennis. Sure. So put stones up by the banks to keep the river in its banks, not flow over. Yeah, it kind of sounds like he's just talking in general, right? Very much. Anytime you're scattering stones, that's the season for scattering stones, and when it's time to gather them, that's the time to gather them, whatever the purpose is. He doesn't define the purpose, just the action. So. Any other insights this gives us, or any other pairs of opposites that stand out to you? Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about that one, but I guess I can now since you brought it up. Yeah, Right. Yeah. Couldn't find Elijah. Yeah, that give up is interesting. That the way that the New International Version translated it, because it's not necessarily give up as in like I give up. You know, when you say I'm tired of searching, I'm going to give up. As in, it's more in the sense of lose, right? So you search to find. There's a time to find, and there's a time to not find, basically, to lose, like they lost Elijah. Any others that stand out? Love, time to love and a time to hate. Yes. That's a good question. If we kind of go back to Pastor's point, is this really about me specifically, or is it about kind of, in general, a time of hate rather than a time for me to hate? And we're actually going to talk about that in the next question, too. Yeah. Right. Exactly. So is it more saying rather that there will be hate in the world rather than you should hate because it's time to hate? That's kind of what we're going to get through in the next one. And hate sin, right? So there are things that should be hated, not other people necessarily, but sin. And hate evil and love the good, right? So there are things to hate, just not hate your neighbor or hate God. Let's talk about number 4. We've kind of covered number 3, pointing out the pairs that stand out. So let's look at number 4. It says the infinitive in English, which is that combination of the word to plus a verb, as in a time to kill, often indicates the necessity of doing something. I'm sure you've said this to your children, either one of these. It's time to eat, or it's time to sleep. So it indicates a necessity, but that kind of sounds strange to us then if God says through Solomon, a time to kill. So when is it my turn to kill? I'll sign up for tomorrow, you sign up for Wednesday or for Friday, and we'll each have our time to kill. Well, let's talk about that. So we'll go to the other page because I didn't have enough room on this page to fit it. See if I can make it all fit on the screen too. Just barely. Or we're talking about killing time, right? As we say in English. So if you take a look here, this is a little bit of a massaged translation or altered translation. It's translated more from the Hebrew. If you look at it, there's quite a few differences. You notice I changed the 2 in each line to a 4. So rather than saying 2, which sounds very much in English, right? Like it's time to kill, so go and kill, right? Or it's time to heal, so now go and heal, to make it more general. Why did I do that? If you look on the right side of the page, that word translated 2 in verses 2 through 8a is translated 4 in verse 1 and in verse 8b. So where it says, verse 1 is exactly the same, except for I said appointed time. There's an appointed time for everything. That's the same word, for, as the for now and the 2 in the New International Version, and every other version uses a 2 also. So it's okay to use that word for instead of 2, because it's the same word. Then that word time that you see in verse 1, there is a time for everything, is not the word that's time in verses 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. It's actually the word that they translate as season. The word that's there is the general word for time, but they took it as season, and I took it as season also. So rather than a specific time, it's the hour to eat or the time to eat. It's the season of doing whatever, giving birth, dying. That word is the same. So it says, and a season for every activity under the heavens, and then Solomon goes on to explain what those various seasons are. A season for giving birth, a season for dying, a season for planting, a season for uprooting, and so on. I think they keep it in English the way it is because that's how it's been translated for many, and it's, of course, a fine translation, but perhaps gives the wrong impression that it's time to kill, or it's time to tear down, rather than just a more general, this is God's design, rather than this is your obligation to go and do this kind of thing. One more thing, that for plus the verb plus ing, like we have, like for planting, that's how the Latin and Greek translations take it also. So English likes to use the to kill. Latin likes to use for killing, and Greek does also for killing. So maybe a little more general. It sounds a little bit different to our ears in English. At least I thought it did. You can agree or disagree with me on that. Number 5 on your sheet says, so we're looking at those groups, and you noticed I put them into 1, 2, 3, 4 groups of things, and I'll give you my reasoning why I put them into 4 different groups. In verses 2 and 3, you have two. In verse 2, you have 2 where the positive thing comes first, right? Giving birth is positive compared to dying, which is negative. You have planting, which is positive, uprooting, which is negative. And then in verse 3, the order switches. The negative thing comes first, killing, and then healing, tearing down and building. So you have 2 ones where the positive one comes first, 2 ones where the negative one comes first. And then in verses 4 and 5, it starts with 3 where the negative comes first. So you've had that group where it had 2 and 2. Now you're going to get 3 and 3. Verse 7 is we'll talk about that one a little bit more. And then verse 8 starts with a positive, and the second one is a negative and then a positive. So that's why I grouped them like that. I don't know if that's what Solomon was thinking, but kind of stood out to me that way. So what do these various groups, you kind of can get maybe a theme out of some of those groups. The group with verses 2 and 3, the group with verses 4, 5, and 6, the group with verse 7, and the group with verse 8. What patterns do you see in those various groups? I separated them with space in between. So in verses 2 and 3, the positive ones are giving birth, planting, healing, building. The negative ones are dying, uprooting, killing, tearing down. It's kind of just life, right? Birth and death. Planting and uprooting are very much a parallel to birth and death, right? Except with plants rather than human beings. Killing and healing. Even tearing down and building. Building is kind of the birth of the building, and the tearing down would be the end of the building, the death of the building. So we have life and death in that first group. Anything else? Any of the other groups? Or even the first group still? Positive ones are bold, the negative ones are italicized. Yeah, a lot of emotions there and feelings. Weeping, laughing, mourning, dancing, embracing, refraining from embracing. Anyone else? tearing your robes, perhaps? It, yeah, it almost fits with the group ahead of it, too, right? Because of the emotion language in verse 4 and 5. So tearing your robes, and then a time when the period of mourning is over. You still need those robes. Got to put them back together, sew them back together. Anything else that stands out from these groups? I suppose you could say in verse 8, right, that love and hate are kind of the emotions behind war and peace. War and peace would be hate and love on a much grander scale. How about number 6? So we see this going back and forth. Sometimes the positive phrase goes first. Sometimes the negative phrase goes first. What is the constant going back and forth, changing the order kind of due to the poetry, Jim? Yeah. 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 So one thing you can get disappointment out of this, right? Especially when it's two negatives in a row, right? You go a season for planting and a season for uprooting and then a season for killing. It's kind of like you said, Jim. It's when the good runs out, and usually when the good runs out, that doesn't immediately mean that the good comes back. Sometimes things pile on. You can get oppressed or overwhelmed by that. As Solomon would say, there's nothing new under the sun, but we're definitely feeling it right now. Right. Right. Sure. Yeah. It's not the season yet. Yeah. Right. Exactly, because the season, he didn't say specifically a season for suffering, but he could have, right? That there's a season for suffering and a season for not suffering, being at peace, right? It is. Yeah. So we see the effects of sin all over the place in here too, right? Even when the good things lead, something brought about by sin follows and causes, well, the first one, right? Season for giving birth, and sin brings then death. Perhaps a little comforting to realize, especially when we use the word season, right? Seasons change, and so eventually God takes away the hand that's bringing the suffering for a while and brings his healing hand and brings good. Yes, it was to remind me that I wanted to talk about those. So yeah, so the asterisk on losing is because it says in the NIV, giving up, and I thought giving up, it can mean giving something up to somebody else or just giving it away, but I thought it was a little too close to when you say give up as in surrender or stop trying. I thought losing maybe was a little clearer of what Solomon was trying to say. The asterisk on verse 7 is the next question, I believe. Yes, so we'll get to that in just a second. But yeah, you kind of see the pattern of life in here, right? And sometimes it goes good, bad, good, bad, good, bad, but sometimes it goes good, bad, bad, and then good. Anyone else? Right. Yeah. Yeah. And just as God decides when it will rain and when there will be drought, He also decides when these seasons come for us. It's out of our hands. In ways that's frustrating because we like to have control. In many ways that's also comforting to know that He's in control. Anyone else? Let's look at verse 7, the second part of it. A season for being silent and a season for speaking. This is number 7 on your handout. You noticed I didn't bold or italicize either be silent or speak because I wanted to discuss which one is the positive one and which one is the negative one. They're pretty neutral on the surface. If you want a hint, I gave several Bible passages where Solomon talks about speaking and being silent in other places. What do you think? Which one is the positive one? Okay. Yeah. Sure. So, right. So it kind of depends on what you're speaking about or being silent about. Yeah, if it's talking about speaking about God and His love and His Son, like you said, Linda, when is the time that you want to be silent about that, right? Yeah. Jim. Mm. So take a step back and stay silent until you know what to say. Sounds like you read. I know you didn't. I didn't see you reading them, but sounds like you are on thinking the same way Solomon is in a lot of those other verses. Very much, especially in Proverbs. He uses the words fool and foolish and wise, and it's the fool who speaks without thinking about it or without getting all the information. It's the wise who holds his tongue and perhaps even holds his tongue when he does know the right answer, because is it best to speak now or is it best to be silent. Jesus was good at that. Yeah. Right. Have you really thought this through? Do you really understand what you're saying? He was good at, well, of course he knows all things, right? So he has an advantage too, but very good at speaking at the right time and saying the right thing, of course, as our Savior. So, anyone else? Which one's positive, which one's negative? Being silent or speaking? Equal. Why do you say that, Pastor? Yeah. Sure. At least while they were drunk, right? Yeah. It's kind of throwing pearls before swine. Yeah, yeah. Sure, sure. I'll read for you some of the things Solomon says about speaking and being silent. In Proverbs 10:19, he says, "When words are many, sin is not absent, but he who holds his tongue is wise." In 13 verse 3, he says, still Proverbs, "He who guards his lips guards his life, but he who speaks rashly will come to ruin." 17:28. He says, "Even a fool is thought wise if he keeps silent, and discerning if he holds his tongue." I'll read a couple from the book of Ecclesiastes too. Flipped way too far. So we'll get to these verses later on, of course. From chapter 5, verse 2, "Do not be quick with your mouth, do not be hasty in your heart to utter anything before God." Verse 7, "Much dreaming and many words are meaningless, therefore stand in awe of God." And 9, verse 17, "The quiet words of the wise are more to be heeded than the shouts of a ruler of fools." So it seems Solomon kind of leans on the side of being silent, but he's talking in a very kind of almost specific context of not speaking when you don't know anything or haven't thought through what you're talking about. So we can probably bring that in here. I would say that being silent for Solomon was much more the positive one, at least in the things he's normally talking about. Kind of fits with our pattern of going back and forth too. If you have one that was negative and then now a positive, it would kind of make sense to go positive and then negative, because then he goes positive again and then negative again and then positive. But I don't know. I guess I'll get to ask Solomon someday, but not today. Let's look at number 8. Discuss whether the various seasons in verses 2 through 8 apply to each human being individually or to humanity in general. Could be both. So they're not necessarily things that just happen to me, but they happen to others as well. So the individual is singled out, but it does apply to humanity in general as well. I would definitely say both. I would also even kind of say perhaps some apply more to individuals and some apply more to humanity in general, right? Like a season for war and a season for peace. One man does not wage war by himself, but a whole country does. He fights alongside, of course, if he's in the military. And the same goes for the peace, right? One person doesn't enjoy, at least peace between nations by themselves. The country as a whole enjoys that peace. Of course, there is peace for individuals as well. Season of dancing doesn't apply to you, Pastor. Not me either. Right. If you don't just limit it to dancing in particular, right? If you take it poetically and see the broader meaning of joy, then certainly. So now when you hear this song by the Byrds, right? There's a time for everything. You'll think back and you'll think through all these things. Let's go to the next couple verses, 9 through 15. It says, "What do workers gain from their toil?" There's something Solomon's already said before, but he's going to come back to it again. "I have seen the burden God has laid on the human race. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. I know that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and to do good while they live, that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. This is the gift of God. I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it, and nothing can taken from it. God does it so people will fear him. Whatever is has already been, and what will be has been before. God will call the past to account." All right. So, you see right away in verse 10 that the NIV translates this word right here as burden. Could be a burden. It's just kind of more of a general word for task or occupation or business. They chose burden because Solomon is very pessimistic. If you look on your sheet, there's a couple other choices. Different translations translate it differently. The ESV, "I have seen the business that God has given the children of man to be busy with." CSB, "I have seen the task that God has given the children of Adam to keep them occupied." And EHV, "I have seen the task which God has given the children of Adam to keep them busy." Busy work. Verse number 10 is another note. The beginning of verse 11 calls back to the poem in verses 1 through 8. God has made everything right or beautiful in its season. So when it's a time for giving birth, it's beautiful, because that's the way God's designed it. When it's a time for dying, it's also beautiful, happening at the time that God has designed it. Number 11, how about this one? In verse, there we go. I gotta look here. 11, he uses that phrase, "He has set eternity in the human heart." Discuss that meaning, the meaning of that phrase. So he's recognized very much so far that a human being, all of us human beings, we're bound by time. We know the seasons, not just the seasons, spring, summer, winter, and fall, but the seasons of life, right? But he has also set eternity in the human heart. What is he referring to? Referring to Jesus. By faith, Christians at least have the eternal Christ in our hearts. I think he's speaking perhaps a little more generally, though, than just faith in Jesus. He's including unbelievers in here, too. In what way has he set eternity in the human heart? So you think of good and evil, heaven and hell. So why is it that human beings focus on life after death, right? Animals don't focus on life after death. They don't think about that kind of thing. What's different about us? We have a soul. We have the breath of life that God breathed into Adam's nostrils. We have a soul. We have an innate knowledge of God, right? It's not a perfect knowledge of God. It's not even a knowledge that knows who the true God is, but it's a knowledge that knows that there is a God. As Paul mentions in Romans chapter 1, right? That even, as he says, the Gentiles have the law written on their hearts. And how do you know that? Because they follow the law, not because they've read it in the Bible, but because their conscience tells them what God wants them to do. And their conscience also accuses them when they haven't done what is right. And that's what gets people thinking about life after death, because there's this sense that I will be judged. Will I be judged good, or will I be judged wicked? So eternity is on the mind as well. Even though we get focused on the time-bound existence we have now, human beings think about eternity because of the natural knowledge of God. And the soul. So we'll come back to that in just a little bit when we get down into the last verses of this chapter. All right, so he mentions two kinds of work, really. He mentions human beings' work, and he mentions God's work. So compare the work of human beings with the work of God. No comparison. As one of the people Right. God's work is perfect. It does exactly what he wants it to accomplish. Man's work is imperfect. It doesn't even come close to doing everything we wish we could accomplish. So even if you put in a little bit more effort, you still can't reach perfection. So it's imperfect compared to God's, which is completely perfect. If you muddy the conscience enough and silence it enough, you can think you can reach perfection. Absolutely. Any other comparisons between the work of God and the work of man? As one of the people I knew in Peru liked to say when she would visit a new place, there's not even a point of comparison to any place I've visited before. When Judgment Day, right? Yeah, is work with the world, right? And so it even says in the verses we just read that God's work endures forever. Contrast that with human work. Human work comes to an end. It's always temporary. When in Psalm 146, when the author of that psalm says, "Do not trust in princes, in mortal men who cannot save," what's the reason? Because they only last a little while and then they die, and everything they did dies with them. Jim. In what way? So this kind of goes into something we. Yeah. So God has created us, and what we do is His work because He created us, right? We would distinguish between His work being also than the sin we commit, right? Because God doesn't sin, but He has created us. We actually talked about this a little bit at our last pastors' meeting at the beginning of this month, the difference between God creating us, and that's the work of God, and then God being then responsible for sin also because of that. There's a distinction between that. But He's created us, but it's us alone who sin against Him. True. Yeah. There's so many things out there that are sins, and there unfortunately also are so many things in here that are sins too, right? And thankfully, by faith in Jesus, we are forgiven, and He comes and He lives in our hearts and helps us not to sin. Absolutely. Right. Yeah, God sends His representatives, His people, right, to be lights in the world, as Jesus says in Matthew 5. You are the lights of the world. Absolutely. Anyone else? So we've got perfection, imperfection for the work of God. We've got temporary versus permanent or eternal for God's work as well. Any other differences between man's work and God's work? God's created us, and so everything we do is because He's created us. I suppose it goes back to kind of what Pastor said about perfect. It's also efficient, right? It accomplishes what it desires, where man's work maybe accomplishes part of what we desire, but doesn't always do it as much as we'd like. How about number 13? Discuss the reasons that God gives human beings work to do. He says in verse 13 that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. This is the gift of God. So why does God give human beings work to do instead of letting us just sit around and exist? Be couch potatoes. Germany just said something. It was either a newspaper, I don't know, or the government or something said something like that. The couch potatoes have been the heroes of this pandemic because, they haven't left their houses. So, why does God give human beings work to do? You could look at verse 9 also. That kind of gives an indication. Or verse 10 in the NIV isn't very clear, but if you go back to the other page, it's a little more clear why God gives human beings work to do with those translations from those other versions. I'll just read the ESV. It says, I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. Belinda. Idle hands are the devil's plaything or devil's workshop? Right. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. He says, find satisfaction, right, in their toil, right? So that's one of the reasons God gives us work to do, is so that we can find satisfaction in what we do. Exactly. That's right. He keeps us busy with other works too, right? Like our mission to go and share the good news. And so we see then that our work isn't just for ourselves, but it's for others as well. Yeah, go ahead, Pastor. Very true. Yeah. Right, right. Yeah, so you're right. So because of sin, not everyone likes the job that they do or have, right? And some people get too involved in their work and neglect other roles and responsibilities. Yeah. There's so many ditches to fall into, aren't there? Belinda. There's a balance between doing work as in my career or my job, right, my profession, and also the other, you can call them jobs too, right, that I have, like mother or father or son or daughter or what have you, right? Plenty of other jobs. It was interesting. I was looking up, because it was just Reformation, a few weeks ago, looking up Luther quotes, and I'd heard the story, and I actually heard someone else repeat this story, but I guess it's not a true story, that he had at one time said, there was a shoemaker who said, Luther, how can I, best use my profession to serve God? Should I put little crosses on the shoes? And Luther said, no, just, make the best shoes that you can. And I guess that's not really a true story. And the reason why this article I was reading said it wasn't is because Luther probably wouldn't have said it that way. He would have said, it's not just about making the shoes the best you can, right? Because that's only for you. But it's making the best shoes you can and charging a fair price to the people that you are selling them to, so that they can have good quality shoes. So doing what you do, but not just for you, but for your neighbor. So that's another reason God gives us work to do, right? So that we can live out our faith and serve Him and our neighbor. If a man shall not work, he shall not eat. Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say, what about all the retired folk? They're not working, right? They've worked, though. They have worked. Right. Exactly. Right. That's not going to work very well, but you're right. Yeah, so there are, I don't know if you want to call them exceptions, right? What Paul was writing against at that time was these people in Thessalonica who they were waiting for Jesus to come back, and so they said, I don't need to work because he's going to come back tomorrow and I'll just go to heaven. Well, except, it's been about 2,000 years since then. And if they had not worked, they would have not had anything to eat. So, does that apply today? Yes, it does, right? If you're unwilling to work, but you are able to work, you should find some way to work, right? And of course, it's not only circumstances of physically able, right? if you're in, and perhaps that's not always as true in the United States as it is in other places, right? But just the lack of work that there is. When I was in Peru, I always go back to Peru, I guess, but there were plenty of people who couldn't find a job, and so what did they do? They did tricks in the street, like juggling and riding unicycles or washing windshields, finding a job, right? This wasn't a job anyone gave them. They just went out there and did it. And making money, right? Earning money, doing something, trying to do something. So a lot of people who are going, I was surprised by that number I mentioned in the sermon last Sunday, that it was 1 out of 10 people in this county right here who go hungry. And I was kind of confused because whenever the reports or the news reports on it, they always say, have enough to eat, and that sounds kind of, I don't know. What means enough to eat for one person might mean different for another person or a different family, right? But it's that they just can't afford to really buy any food at all. They're living, hand to mouth, very much day to day. Scary times. Not that number isn't, that 1 in 10 isn't that actually that different than the national average either. It's about 1 in 10 Americans who don't have enough to eat. So if you think there are about 335 million people in this country, so 10% of that would be 33.5 million. That's a lot of people. And if the numbers hold for how many children of those are, right? It was 40 out of 100,000, 40,000 out of 100,000, so that's 4%. All right, let's look at the last couple of verses before we completely run out of time. We still got 3 minutes of our time, but we went over last time, so we can go over to this time too, right? Verse 16, and I saw something else under the sun. In the place of judgment, wickedness was there. In the place of justice, wickedness was there. I said to myself, God will bring into judgment both the righteous and the wicked. For there will be a time for every activity, a time to judge every deed. I also said to myself, as for humans, God tests them so that they may see that they are like the animals. Surely the fate of human beings is like that of the animals. The same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so dies the other. All have the same breath. Humans have no advantage over animals. Everything is meaningless. All go to the same place. All come from dust, and to dust all return. Who knows if the human spirit rises upward and if the spirit of the animal goes down into the earth? So I saw that there is nothing better for a person than to enjoy their work, because that is their lot. For who can bring them to see what will happen after them? So we end on a sour note from Solomon, like we do almost every chapter. But looking at God's judgment, so that word justice in the NIV could also be translated righteousness. That was the point of including the verse from the ESV here. Number 14, discuss the reasons Solomon connects God's judgment to the season for everything under heaven. Because he uses the same word, right? There's a time for every activity and a time to judge every deed. So we're back in that mode of thinking again, the season for every activity and a season to judge every deed. The judgment, you can't change it, right? So there's nothing that follows the judgment except the result of the judgment, right? Either heaven or hell. So yeah, 15 is kind of a transitional verse, especially with the last line, and God will call the past to account. And then there's going to be judgment. Yeah. So we see it as part of the pattern. It's kind of the last season, right? All those other seasons come and go. They maybe even repeat. But then finally, after death, or when Jesus comes again, judgment comes. So that's the next season. Number 15. We'll go a little quicker here. Discuss in what ways God wants human beings to see that they are like animals. We wouldn't necessarily put it that way ourselves, especially in this day and age when people who are unbelievers insist that humans are only animals and nothing more. But what does he want us to see about the comparison between us and animals? They're born, they live, and they die. And in that way, we have no advantage over animals. We might live longer than some animals, right? Dogs don't live as long as humans. Cats don't either. But there are other also animals who live much longer than human beings, like giant tortoises. So we're kind of just all in the same boat, at least as far as remaining on this planet goes. We all are born, we all live, we all die. He even says we all have the same breath. And then that same word for breath is used in verse 21. Who knows if the human breath or spirit rises upward, and if the spirit or breath of the animal goes down into the earth? Of course, number 16, Solomon has already kind of hinted that there is a difference indeed between the humans and the animals. Where did he hint that before? What is the difference between human beings and animals? Human beings have souls. He kind of refers to that. He doesn't say soul specifically, right? But he says he has also set eternity in the human heart. A human being reasons, an animal doesn't reason. It might have very minimal reasoning skills, right? But nothing compared to what the human being can do. So capable of showing emotion. But no animal is really able to do 2 plus 2, right? They maybe can get 1 plus 1, but probably not 2 plus 2. I suppose. Yeah. So our last question then, number 17, discuss what Solomon is saying about the person who dies without knowing the gospel. Their spirit does not go upward. It's basically the same as an animal's. We don't usually put it that way. We usually put it in, focus on the... They have the same fate as animals, at least. Have the same fate as animals. I don't know if I wouldn't preach that in a sermon. I wouldn't say, if you're an unbeliever here today, you're an animal. But I would say that your fate is the same, right? No hope for life after death. There's one more note on the bottom of our sheet here. It says, in verse 21, Solomon asks, who knows if the human spirit rises upward and if the spirit of the animal goes down into the earth? Well, Solomon does know. He will answer his own question later on. If you want a spoiler, go to the last chapter, verse 7. You'll see what he says. All right, that's everything for chapter 3. Any final questions or comments? It is. There's a lot in there and a lot of just kind of things to chew on. There you go. Listen to the birds. All right, let's close with a prayer. Dear Lord, we give you thanks for this opportunity today to come and study your word. Lord, we ask that you would remind us that though earth is a wonderful blessing from you, it can't even compare to the eternity you have planned for us through your Son, Jesus Christ. Forgive us, Lord, for the times that we haven't wanted to work or have not trusted your plan, help us through your Son to see your plan for us, that it finally ends in heaven to be with you forever. Who knows if the human spirit goes upward? We know, because you have told us so through your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next month.